Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the BRICS alliance because it's now in real danger of falling apart. Donald Trump is on a mission to punish the BRICS countries, and he recently announced an additional 10% tariff for all countries that are members of BRICS. Now, BRICS originally was just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. However, in 2024, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE also signed up. And in January of this year, Indonesia became the 10th member. Now, they haven't come up with a new acronym. We don't have something with all 10 of these countries in there. So we're just calling it BRICS. But obviously, it's more than just BRICS. So let's hear Donald Trump's thoughts on what's going on with BRICS and why he's introduced this additional 10% tariff.
A couple days ago, you issued a new tariff threat to members of the BRICS countries for if they aligned with anti-American policies.
10%, George.
That would be India, Brazil,
That's
Russia,
right, they have to pay 10% if they're in BRICS. Because
Right.
BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir? Or is
Yeah,
that
pretty soon.
if they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff just for that one thing. And they won't be a member long. I thought BRICS was, I said this about a year ago, and it largely broke up. But, there are a couple that hang around, but I thought it largely broke up. BRICS is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat.
So the 10% tariff that Donald Trump is referring to is actually an additional charge on top of whatever's agreed with each individual country. And we'll go on to look at that in a moment. But I can tell you that all of the BRICS countries appear to be being punished by the USA. So Donald Trump is basically making trade very difficult for all of these nations. And one of the reasons why he's doing this is that he believes that the US dollar is under threat from the BRICS alliance. As I've talked about in previous videos, there was actually some talk of BRICS creating its own common currency that they would all use.
But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar so that another country can take over and be the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard at any time. If you have a smart president, you will never lose the standard. If you have a stupid president like the last one, you would lose the standard. You wouldn't have the dollar as you. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. We're not going to let that happen. The dollar, you ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way, okay? And I'm just saying, if people want to challenge it, they can, but they're going to have to pay a big price.
So Donald Trump's very clear here. He doesn't want BRICS coming anywhere near the US dollar. That's one of the reasons why he's closing down on this alliance and making it much more difficult for those countries to do trade in the USA. And we'll go on to look at that in a moment. But just before we do so, I'd firstly like to ask you if you could subscribe if you haven't done so already. I know a lot of you have subscribed. I've got over 400,000 subscribers. So thank you to every single person who's hit that subscribe button. But I know more than 50% of people watching these videos are not subscribed. So if you could please just hit that subscriber button. It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a subscription. It's just an indication that you like the channel, but it helps me with the algorithm and YouTube and all of those sorts of things. So please do that if you haven't done so already. And also thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you so much for that support. Really helps to keep me going. And just before we go on today, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Strawberry.me, which provides personal online coaching services. Now, this is actually something that I've recently become involved with because historically I never had any personal coaching. I just relied upon people I was working with. And the problem with that is that it can be very erratic. It depends on who your boss is, how good they are, and motivating you, setting you goals, all of those sorts of things. And in my experience, I didn't have some great bosses in the past. But personal coaching is an absolutely fantastic tool to give you goals and to really get you focused on developing yourself, because the best investment that you will ever make in your life is investing into you. And personal coaching is a really good way of doing this, whether you've got short-term goals, medium-term, or long-term. Now, I've been using strawberry.me for a long time now, for about the last 6 months. And my coach, Colleen, has really helped me to focus on what I'm looking to achieve, to set objectives and give me updates. And basically, it's somebody to check in with who's on your side. They're rooting for you. They want you to succeed by helping you to achieve your goals and by setting milestones and then coming back and talking about it. It really helps to keep you focused, and it certainly helped me. So if you're interested in setting up some personal coaching, then take the test. You can go online, you set up a test so that you'll be then matched with a personal coach, and then you can have online sessions. It's all very confidential. All of the coaches are certified, so they're all qualified to be doing this, and that will help you to develop yourself, hopefully fast forward all of your objectives, get you where you want to be, and just give you that boost, that motivation that you've been looking for. So strawberry.me, if you have a look in the description below, you'll find the link and you can get a $50 credit. Now, in terms of the deals that have been announced so far, I'm sure if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware of what's been going on between the USA and China, which is obviously the biggest economy in BRICS. It's the second largest economy in the world. And you'll know that at one point, the tariffs were reported to be 145%. That was at the height of the trade war. However, it's now been agreed that they'll be reduced to 30% for most Chinese imports into the USA, plus this additional 10% that's now being charged for all members of BRICS. So all imports to the USA from China are now going to cost 40% more than they did before Donald Trump took over. But that's actually not as bad as Brazil, which has now been hit with a 50% tariff. So that is significantly penal. Now, there have been some exceptions to that. The USA have actually carved out orange juice because they import a lot of orange juice from Brazil, and also airline parts, and the other one is energy products. So any oil that's being exported from Brazil won't be subject to that 50% charge. But everything else, all other items, will have 50% plus a 10% charge. So that was bad news for those two countries. But India saw itself as a close ally of the USA. If you remember back in February, Modi actually flew to the White House and we had a joint press conference where both Donald Trump and Modi said that they were friends and that they were hoping to forge a long-lasting and fruitful relationship. And it was reported that India was expecting a tariff to come in at around about 13%, which actually would have been less than the 15% recently announced for Japan and South Korea. However, that hasn't really played out the way India thought it was going to. And on the 30th of July, the first indication that we had that things weren't going as swimmingly as we thought was when Donald Trump posted this on his Truth Social website. It says, "Remember, while India is our friend, we have over the years done relatively little business with them because their tariffs are far too high, among the highest in the world. And they have the most strenuous and obnoxious non-monetary trade barriers of any country. Also, they have always bought a vast majority of their military equipment from Russia and are Russia's largest buyer of energy, along with China, at a time when everyone wants Russia to stop the killing in Ukraine. All things not good. India will therefore be paying a tariff of 25% plus a penalty for the above, which is the 10% that we've been talking about, starting on August the 1st. Thank you for your attention on this matter." Now, Donald Trump followed that up with another post on Truth Social, on the 31st of July, which says, "I don't care what India does with Russia. They can take their dead economies down together for all I care. We have done very little business with India. Their tariffs are too high, among the highest in the world. Likewise, Russia and the USA do almost no business together. Let's keep it that way and tell Medvedev, the failed former president of Russia, who thinks he's still president, to watch his words. He's entering very dangerous territory." Now, that relates to what I covered off in a recent video when Donald Trump came out and basically said that Russia had 10 or 12 days to agree a peace deal in Ukraine. Otherwise, the USA was going to impose 100% secondary tariffs on Russia, which basically would have meant that anybody doing business with Russia in the future will have to pay a 100% tariff on all imports to the USA. So clearly, China and India were right at the top of that list, but all of the other BRICS countries would also be subject to it. So this is basically Donald Trump saying, I'm now going after all of the BRICS countries, including Russia. And Medvedev came out and basically said, nobody threatens Russia. We're not the same as Iran. You need to be careful that you could get yourself into a war, and compared Donald Trump to Joe Biden, which I think probably upset him immensely. So Donald Trump's come back with that, basically putting Dmitry Medvedev in his place. But the situation they've got now with regards to India is obviously quite serious, because they've now got 25% plus 10% tariffs, so 35% compared to what they had before Donald Trump took over. And the USA is actually the biggest single trading partner for Indian exports. And if you have a look at this graphic, it shows what those exports are made up of. And the size of the bubbles here relate to the size of the business. So the bigger the bubble, the bigger the amount of exports from India. And you can see that the biggest single export in the last 12 months was pharmaceutical preparations. So these are things that are being used in the drug industry in the USA. The labor-intensive part of it, extracting all of the different things that you need to make up all of your medicines, that's being done in India because it's much cheaper to do that, because the labor costs are lower. So we're having all of these things exported to the USA, and then the final drugs are actually put together in the US. You can see that equated to $13 billion in 2024. So a large chunk of cash from India's point of view. And in terms of the percentage of the imports, that was 5.3%. So quite a big chunk of all of those imports from the USA's point of view. The next biggest export from India was cell phones and other household goods. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Apple was one of the countries that actually moved a lot of its assembly of iPhones and other products from China to India during Donald Trump's previous presidency, because he wanted to move businesses out of China. And unfortunately, they're now being hit with higher tariffs than China, or equal tariffs to China. So that's bad news for companies like Apple. Gems and diamonds were the third largest at 6.7 billion, followed by cotton, apparel and household goods, so basically textiles, 5.9 billion. And then we've got jewelry at 3.5, industrial machines at 2.6, and then a variety of other products. So the point really of this graphic is to show you that we've got a lot of bubbles here. There's a lot of different industries that are exporting things to the USA, and these industries are going to be hurt by this new 35% tariff, because it will make it more expensive, and it's likely, therefore, that the amount of demand will fall, and so Indian companies will lose out. I thought it was worth having a look at this graphic, which looks at the deals that have been done with BRICS countries so far by the USA. So right at the top here, we've got Brazil. You can see, as we just discussed, 50% tariff plus the 10% bonus tariff, or the penalty tariff, for being a member of BRICS. So a total of 60% for everything apart from the exemptions we talked about. And in 2024, Brazil exported over $44 billion worth of goods to the US. That was around 15% of all of Brazil's exports. So the biggest market, it's going to be really bad news for a lot of those companies. India, we've just discussed, 25% plus 10%, 35% total. The total value of the exports, over 87 billion. So huge, 18% of India's exports going to the USA. China is now at 40%, 30 plus 10. It exported just under $440 billion worth of goods in 2024, 17% of China's exports. South Africa, that hasn't been finalized yet, but we're expecting it to be 30% because it's a member of BRICS, plus the 10%. So probably 40%, 14.7 billion in 2024, equating to just under 10% of South Africa's exports. Now, Indonesia's an interesting one because it's only recently joined BRICS, and it's got a framework deal of 19%, but obviously the new 10% surplus is going to be added as well. So that will take all of Indonesia's exports to 29%, which is a big uplift. And we're talking about just under $30 billion worth of goods exported in 2024. A lot of it was textiles, electronics, and rubber. So those companies are really going to suffer with this 30% increase in price. There isn't much trade between the USA and Russia at the moment because of the sanctions, but if there was any, the 10% penalty would be applied. And then we've got Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. Deals haven't been announced yet, but the 10% charge will apply to all of those. And you can see that there's a reasonable amount of trade, even though it's relatively small in percentages. We're still talking just under $3 billion from Egypt and over $5 billion from the UAE. So we're looking at a serious amount of trade that's going to be impacted here. And I thought it was worth having a look at what the implications of this will be from the USA's point of view, because as we've talked about many times before, the tariffs, whilst it sounds like the countries involved are being penalized, it's actually US businesses and consumers that are going to have to pay those tariffs, because when the goods land in the USA, they'll be held in customs, and the only way you can get those goods released is by paying the tariff to US customs. So it's the US people who are paying for this. And I thought it was worth having a look at how much extra cost we're talking about here. So we start at the top. Brazil, the amount of trade they did in 2024, if we apply the new 60% tariff, that would equate to an increase of $26.5 billion in the cost of all of those products. For India, the 35% increase will increase the total amount to by 30.6 billion. Now that's a massive increase. That's actually bigger than the increase charged for Brazil, even though the percentage is lower for India. Because they've got a higher volume of goods, it's more in cash terms. It's even worse from China's point of view. The 40% additional tariff that's going to be applied equates to an additional cost of over $175 billion. Now, that's just assuming that the same amount of volume is imported. That's how much more it will cost US consumers and businesses. South Africa, we're looking at additional cost of just under $6 billion. Indonesia, it's over $8.5 billion. Then we've got Egypt is around 290 million, and Ethiopia 45 million, and the UAE 530 million. But the point of this graphic really is just to highlight the impact on US prices and therefore US inflation, which potentially could have some serious implications for the US economy, because if inflation starts rising, then the Fed will want to increase interest rates at the same time as Donald Trump wants them to be reduced. So even though all of the BRICS countries are going to lose out seriously as a result of these new tariffs, so will US consumers, and potentially this could have a big impact on the US economy over the next 12 to 18 months. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because the BRICS alliance, there's been a lot of talk about it since it was first established. Could it become a major competitor to the West? In terms of the world population, it's the biggest single alliance. It's got the two biggest countries in the world, in India and China, both of whom have a population of around 1.4 billion. I know that will mean lots of people sending me messages saying it's not 1.4 billion in China, it's only about 800,000, but let's just take it as read that they are the two largest countries in the world. So theoretically, if this alliance could get its act together, if it could work as a genuine trade partnership, then it could become a major challenger to the West. It could create its own currency. It could become a dominant force. However, we haven't really seen that happening over the last 10 to 15 years. In fact, there's been very little progress whatsoever. I recently talked about the fact in a recent video that despite the fact that it set up the new bank that was meant to help fund lots of infrastructure and development in all of the different countries, there has been only a handful of projects so far approved, and it hasn't really made any material movements. So it isn't really going anywhere. And as Donald Trump said earlier in this video, he thought that it had actually fallen apart. Now, interestingly, at its recent annual summit, on the day that they met, on the first day of that summit, Donald Trump announced his additional 10% tariff for all members of BRICS. So obviously, that was detrimental because the US market is the biggest single export market for all of these countries apart from Russia, which obviously is under severe sanctions and isn't selling anything into the USA at the moment. So that 10% in itself would have been damaging. However, what we've seen from today's data is that over the past few weeks, we've started to see the deals being announced, and the deals for BRICS members are highly penal. Brazil is facing a tariff of 50%, so that means a total of 60%. And it's just been announced that India is now being hit with this 25% tariff, which was actually quite a shock because I think India thought that they were doing quite well in terms of the relationship with Donald Trump, and they were going to come out better than places like the European Union and Japan and South Korea, all of whom have got a 15% tariff. But they've actually come out much worse, slightly better than China's 30%, but only just. And this is going to represent a major problem, not just for India, but also all of the other BRICS countries, because they're losing access to the biggest market in the world. The US is the largest economy. It's the most attractive. It's the one that every company wants to crack. They want to send lots of products to the US. But having a tariff applied to all of your exports means that everything will cost more, and therefore the buyers may decide that they want to go elsewhere. Now, the reason that Donald Trump is doing this is that he believes that BRICS is acting against the interests of the USA. So firstly, they've got Russia in BRICS, so by definition, they've buddied up with Russia. They've got part of an alliance. But also, he believes that the BRICS alliance is trying to do something to undermine the US dollar, that one of the currencies from those countries wants to overtake the dollar. And theoretically, that would probably be the Chinese yuan. It's the second biggest economy, and it's one of the biggest traded currencies in the world. So he doesn't want that to happen. So he's now trying to break this BRICS alliance by putting big tariffs on it and also saying you're going to have an extra tariff just by being a member of BRICS. So it will be really interesting to see what the response is from all of these countries. We don't know what India is going to do yet, because India may come back and try to renegotiate this deal by reducing the tariffs that it's charging on US imports. It was recently reported by Donald Trump that India is charging around 70% on all cars that are imported from the US into India. And we've got other tariffs that are meant to be 30, 40, 50, 60%. So quite high for all US imports. India is protecting its home market. Now, the USA is now doing a similar thing for imports from India, but that's going to hurt a lot of Indian businesses. So we need to wait and see what India's response is. But if it's similar to what we've seen in China and Brazil, then they may just decide that they're going to have to swallow that tariff, that they'll just have to take it on the chin. I don't think a lot of Indian companies will be able to absorb the additional pricing because they don't have enough profit built into their models to be able to do that. So the likelihood is that the price of the goods will increase in the USA. And as I said at the end of today's video, the problem that that may cause for the USA is that it will push up prices and costs, and therefore could push up inflation. And as inflation is the key metric that the Fed is looking to, it could therefore mean that if inflation's going up, the Fed will want to increase interest rates, which potentially would put the brakes on the US economy, because when interest rates go up, it costs more to borrow money for both companies and individuals. Therefore, people tend to borrow less, they will invest less, they will spend less. Therefore, spending goes down, revenue goes down, GDP doesn't grow as rapidly. And all of this could mean that we see a slowdown in the US economy over the next 12 to 18 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for everyone that's supported me, and thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.
Seagull trying to get out. My kid's getting stuck. Are you okay? Fly over it, love. Go on. You're not trapped. Ready? Yeah. Oh, it's a baby.